So let's talk about building your first wireframe. So let's say I'm a founder. I've got this idea in my head, and I want to communicate this to my team. And it's in the early phase, right? It's an idea, and I can either write it down or I can communicate it visually. So how should I think about this? Because there's always this danger, whether you're using low fidelity or high fidelity, you kind of get stuck into, you know, where is the button going to go? And, things that really don't matter at this point, right? So maybe kind of just walk us through like, some steps that, somebody should take when they kind of start the wireframing process.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, especially for founders and people who don't have a designer, is that the person, then the founder or whomever, feels like it's their job to be the designer, and then they think they have to do what they think a designer does, which is make a prototype, make something that looks really good. But in my experience, I was a UX designer for 10 years, and early on, it was very much just production work, just make the thing look good. But as I went on, I found out that what I was missing was an understanding of what's the problem, an understanding of who the user is, and that has such an impact on the design itself. And so I think that a founder shouldn't step out of their founder role, the knowledge that they have about the customer and the problem, and don't try to just think about how am I going to build this thing, but really try to think about, okay, try to focus on asking the right questions. Because in my experience as a designer, the best designers are the ones that ask the most questions or the best questions. So it's not how do I make this look pretty, but it's how do I find the best way to address this issue. And so I think the best way to start a wireframe is with a really bad wireframe. So don't get hung up on trying to make a great wireframe. Going back to what I said earlier about kind of these early phase wireframes where it's just for you, that's your time to not have to think about the usability so much. Just think about the user. And then one of our chapters is all about learning about basic UI controls and UI patterns and templates, and how to think like a UI designer, which is, okay, if I have this workflow, okay, I know this is maybe going to be a form. Here's some best practices for designing forms. Here's some best practices or some different ideas about how to design navigation. So in your head, maybe the best thing to do as a founder, as a non-designer, is just draw a sitemap or draw kind of a flow chart or a diagram. Think about how things are connected, and then learn a little bit about the basics of navigation. Is it horizontal navigation? Is it vertical navigation? Is it tabs? What are the pros and cons of these? And go out and look at other products and other sites that do things similarly, even if it's completely outside of your domain, and then learn some of these techniques for taking, a structure and converting it into a user interface. So one of our chapters is all about learning just what you need to know about UI design, which I think will go a long way. You don't have to become an expert in it.
I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of like fat marker sketches that Basecamp, the team 37 Signals. I don't know what they call themselves these days. Is it Basecamp or 37 Signals?
I didn't know that it came from them, but that is one of my favorite kind of analogies or ways of talking to people about this sort of thing.
Yeah. So I'll include a link in the show notes to maybe a page with an example of a fat marker sketch, because that actually is great, because it's a way of, no one is going to look at one of those sketches and say, oh, you designed the product, right? It's like, okay, here's an idea. You're trying to communicate that. And the way they do it, it kind of helps you avoid thinking about layout. It's almost like just stack things on top of each other, right? Okay, there's going to be a field, there's going to be a button, there's going to be something that's going to do this. I don't really know how it's going to get laid out. I just know it's going to be on the page somewhere. And let's talk about, whether this is the right way to solve this problem or not. So I think that is actually, before we even get into talking about, using tools, that actually is a very simple and easy way for someone who isn't a designer or a founder who wants to communicate or articulate something that's in their head. That's something they can do relatively easily. But I do like the idea of coupling that with some of the, at least having a basic understanding of what you talked about in the book about design patterns and some things like that, because that will only help you to kind of understand what's expected, what's good practice, what isn't good practice. So even though it's still just a sketch, at least you have some of those thoughts in the back of your mind to come up with something that makes more sense to whoever you communicate that to.
Yeah, actually, that's a good reminder. One of the techniques that we mentioned in the book is about like content modeling, or say you're designing a landing page, just write a bunch of sticky notes, whether they're digital sticky notes or actual ones, and think about the priority of them and put the most important ones at the top and then go down from there. And so it's kind of this mix of, it's mostly words, but there's a visual element to it in that by laying them out, not necessarily how they would look on a website, this is the navigation over here, the sidebar, all of this stuff, but just from top to bottom, if you have a landing page, the most important thing should be at the top, and maybe it should be the full width. So to kind of like do this very basic kind of block or chunk kind of diagram, which is just barely visual in the sense that it's just things taking up space, but it has the words, so you know what goes there. So thinking about the content first, and that's the first step to design before you then think about, is the navigation going to be across the top or on the side?
Yeah, I agree. For people watching this on video, so this is from basecamp.com, where they talk about fat marker sketches. And so I think anybody watching on this video can quickly get an idea of, what that looks like. It's not very sophisticated, but it communicates an idea. Let's move on. Let's talk about tools. So, we kind of talked about these phases, which I think is a really useful way to think about this, right? So if everybody knows, look, we're in an early kind of phase, we're going to have different ideas that we're going to consider, try out. Nothing is, set in stone right now. We're just exploring. That just kind of everybody knowing which phase you're in, kind of, I think it will help to set expectations kind of more clearly with everybody. So I like that a lot.